The goddess. There is a statue in the British Museum. It is small, you could hold it in both hands, and it is made of bronze, dark with age, smooth from centuries of handling. It depicts a seated cat. The cat is upright, alert, its tail curled around its front paws with a precision that suggests both repose and readiness. Its ears are pricked forward. Its eyes, once inlaid with glass or stone, are now empty, two hollows that catch the light in ways the original inlays could never have anticipated. Around its neck there is a collar. On its chest, a scarab beetle. At its ears, earrings. It has been adorned, this small bronze cat, with the care and deliberateness of someone dressing a beloved figure for a ceremony. It is not a toy. It is not a decoration. It is a votive offering, an object made to be given to a goddess, carried to a temple, placed before an altar in an act of devotion so sincere that the person who made it spent real money and real time and real craft on producing something worthy. The goddess it was made for was Bastet. And she was, at the height of her worship, one of the most beloved deities in the ancient world, a goddess whose temples drew pilgrims from across the Mediterranean, whose festivals were described by the Greek historian Herodotus as the largest and most joyful celebrations he had ever witnessed anywhere on earth, whose sacred animals were mourned like family members when they died, mummified with as much care as the bodies of pharaohs, and buried in catacombs that held hundreds of thousands of them. Tonight, I want to tell you about this goddess and the civilization that loved her. I want to walk you through her temples and her festivals, through the city that was built in her honor, through the extraordinary cult of the sacred cat that made ancient Egypt one of the strangest and most moving religious cultures in human history. And I want to end, as we always do, with the question that sits beneath all of this: what does it mean that a civilization looked at a cat, this small, warm, indifferent creature that hunts and sleeps and asks nothing of us but proximity, and saw something divine? Let's begin. Bastet did not begin as a cat. She began as a lioness. In the earliest strata of Egyptian religious thought, in the period before the Old Kingdom, before the Great Pyramids, before the unified state that we recognize as ancient Egypt, Bastet was a goddess of fierce solar energy, associated with the burning eye of Ra, the sun god, and depicted with the head of a lioness. She was not gentle. She was not domestic. She was the sun's heat in its most destructive form, the noon sun of the desert, the heat that could kill as easily as it could sustain. This early Bastet was paired, and sometimes conflated, with another leonine goddess, Sekhmet. The two are closely related, and their relationship tells us something important about how the Egyptian religious imagination worked. Sekhmet, whose name means something like the powerful one, was the goddess of war and plague, the destroyer, the extension of Ra's wrath against his enemies. She was the lioness at full ferocity, the burning eye unleashed. Bastet, in the earliest texts, was Sekhmet's gentler counterpart, still fierce, still solar, still capable of destruction, but associated with protection rather than warfare, with the guarding of the home and the king rather than the annihilation of enemies. She was the Tamite to Sekhmet's wild eye, the same fire, turned toward nurture. This duality, the lioness who protects rather than destroys, is the seed from which the cat goddess grew. At some point in the long history of Egyptian religion, probably during the 2nd millennium BCE, Bastet's iconography shifted. The lioness head gave way to the head of a domestic cat. The fierce solar goddess became something softer, more intimate, more accessible. Why? Several explanations have been proposed. The most convincing involves the changing role of the domestic cat in Egyptian society. By the Middle Kingdom period, the domestic cat had become genuinely embedded in Egyptian daily life, living in homes, sleeping in beds, killing the rats and snakes that threatened grain stores and children. The cat had moved from the category of wild animal to the category of household companion, and with that move it became a vessel for the qualities that Bastet represented: protection, warmth, the fierce tenderness of a mother defending her kittens. The goddess who had once been the burning eye of the sun became the purring presence in the house. And in doing so, she became something that ordinary Egyptians could not only fear and revere but actually love. To understand Bastet, you need to understand that the Egyptian gods were not simple. They were not monotheistic figures with consistent personalities and clear moral codes. They were multivalent presences, beings whose nature contained contradictions, whose attributes shifted across texts and periods and regions, who could be simultaneously mother and warrior, destroyer and protector, fierce and tender. Bastet in her fullest development is a goddess of many things. She is, first and most essentially, a goddess of protection. Her most ancient role was as the protector of the pharaoh. She was depicted, in the earliest royal contexts, as a lioness walking beside the king or crouching before him, her ferocity deployed in his service. This protective function survived her transformation into a cat goddess and expanded. She became the protector of the home, the family, the mother, the child. She was invoked against disease, against evil spirits, against the dangers of childbirth. She is a goddess of fertility and sexuality. This association is partly practical. The domestic cat is a famously fertile animal, and the Egyptians observed this with their characteristic attention to the natural world, and partly symbolic. Bastet was associated with the music and dancing and sensual pleasure that were central to her great festival at Bubastis. She was connected to the erotic dimension of life, to the pleasure of the body, to the joy that made existence worth sustaining. She is a goddess of music and celebration. The sistrum, a kind of rattle used in Egyptian religious ceremonies, a percussion instrument whose sound was believed to please the gods and drive away evil, was her instrument. Priests and priestesses of Bastet shook the sistrum in her temples. The sound of it became associated with her presence, with her pleasure, with the particular quality of joyful energy that her cult produced. And she is a goddess of the sun, in her most ancient form, and always underneath her later domesticity, connected to the solar energy that animated everything in Egyptian religion. She could be described as the eye of Ra, the protective, fierce, loving aspect of solar power that watches over what it loves and burns what threatens it. These qualities do not contradict each other. In the Egyptian religious imagination, they are all aspects of the same essential nature, the nature of a being who is simultaneously intimate and cosmic, domestic and divine. If Bastet had a home on earth, it was Bubastis. The city stands, or rather, its ruins stand, in the eastern Nile Delta, near the modern Egyptian city of Zagazig. In antiquity, it was one of the most important religious centers in Egypt, the seat of Bastet's great temple, the destination of the most celebrated annual pilgrimage in the ancient world. Its Egyptian name was Bastet, the house of Bastet, and the Greeks, who visited it and wrote about it extensively, called it Bubastis. The site was inhabited from the pre-dynastic period, from before the unified Egyptian state, and continued to be occupied for more than 3,000 years. It was at various points a regional capital, a seat of pharaonic power, and always, above all, a religious center dedicated to its goddess. The temple of Bastet at Bubastis was described by Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, and his description has the quality of something witnessed by someone genuinely astonished. He describes a temple precinct surrounded by water, channels of the Nile diverted to create a kind of island on which the main temple stood, accessible only by a causeway. The temple itself, he says, was not the largest or most impressive he saw in Egypt, but the grove of trees that surrounded it, enormous old trees growing in the temple enclosure, their canopy shading the stone, gave it a quality of beauty and mystery that he found more affecting than the grander temples of Karnak or Memphis. The sacred cats of Bastet lived in and around this temple. They were tended by priests and priestesses. They were fed. They were adorned. They were, in the most literal sense, the living embodiment of the goddess, her presence in the world, her agents, her beloved. When they died, they were mourned. Herodotus devoted considerable space in his histories to the festival of Bastet at Bubastis, and his account remains one of the most vivid descriptions of Egyptian religious practice to survive from antiquity. The festival took place annually, in the spring. Pilgrims came from across Egypt, from the Delta, from Upper Egypt, from the oases, from the Sinai, converging on Bubastis by boat along the Nile and its channels. Herodotus estimated that the festival drew 700,000 pilgrims, making it the largest religious gathering in Egypt. Modern historians are skeptical of the precise number, but the scale of the event, the infrastructure required, the logistics of feeding and sheltering hundreds of thousands of people, is consistent with a genuinely enormous gathering. The journey to Bubastis was itself part of the ritual. Boats crowded the Nile, packed with pilgrims singing, playing the alas and the crotala, clapping their hands. When the boats passed near a town on the banks, the women aboard, there were, Herodotus notes, many more women than men among the pilgrims, would call out to the women on shore, shouting and making gestures, and the shore women would shout back. There was wine. There was a great deal of wine. The atmosphere Herodotus describes is one of joyful, almost raucous celebration. Entirely unlike the solemn, hieratic quality we sometimes associate with ancient religious practice. At Bubastis itself, the festival involved sacrifices, music, dancing, and a great communal feast. Wine was consumed, Herodotus says, in quantities greater than in all the rest of the year combined. The atmosphere was one of release, of permission, of the divine sanction of pleasure. Bastet, the goddess of joy and music and the body's warmth, was being honored in her own idiom. There is something remarkable about this. In a religious culture often associated, in the popular imagination, with funerary rites and the preparation for death, the festival of Bastet was an enormous, wine-soaked celebration of life. The Egyptians did not worship Bastet despite the shadow of death that fell across their civilization. They worshipped her because of it, because the love of life was inseparable from the awareness of its limits. The temple of Bastet was served by a specialized priesthood, male and female, whose role was to tend the goddess and her sacred animals. The sacred cats of Bastet's temple were not ordinary cats. They were selected for particular qualities, perhaps for their markings, perhaps for their behavior, perhaps for signs that the priests interpreted as indicators of divine presence. Once selected, they lived in the temple precinct, fed on special food, tended with the care given to any sacred being. Visitors to the temple could observe them, and the cats' behavior, the way they moved, where they chose to rest, how they responded to supplicants, was sometimes interpreted as oracular, as the goddess's own communication. The priesthood of Bastet also included a class of musicians, the sistrum players whose rattling percussion accompanied temple rituals and whose sound was understood to please the goddess. Music was not, in Egyptian religious practice, an optional enhancement to the ritual. It was the ritual, the sound that opened a channel between the human and the divine, that created the conditions in which the goddess could be present. Women played a particularly prominent role in the cult of Bastet. The goddess was explicitly associated with femininity, with the qualities of motherhood, fertility, and protective ferocity that the Egyptians associated with the female, and the great majority of the pilgrims at her festival, as Herodotus notes, were women. The temple's musical staff included large numbers of priestesses. The cult gave women a ritual and social role that was not always available in other contexts. This is not to say that men were excluded, they were not. But the cult of Bastet was one of the spaces in ancient Egyptian religious life where female religious authority was most visible and most celebrated. The relationship between Bastet and the pharaonic institution is ancient, intimate, and theologically significant. From the earliest period of Egyptian history, the pharaoh was understood to be not merely a human king but a divine being, the living embodiment of Horus, the god of kingship, and on death, the embodiment of Osiris, the god of the afterlife. The pharaoh's divinity was expressed partly through his relationship with the other gods, and Bastet was among those most closely associated with royal protection. She was described in royal texts as the mother of the king, a fierce, loving presence who had nursed the pharaoh, who watched over him as a lioness watches over her cubs. This maternal protective role gave her a specific theological function in the royal cult. She was the power that kept the king safe, that warded off the enemies of the throne, that ensured the continuity of the divine kingship that ordered Egyptian civilization. Several pharaohs of the New Kingdom period built temples to Bastet and recorded their devotion to her. The pharaohs of the 22nd dynasty, who came from Libyan ancestry and ruled from Bubastis itself, were particularly devoted to the cat goddess. It was under their rule, in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, that Bubastis reached the peak of its importance and that the worship of Bastet became, arguably, the dominant popular religion of the Nile Delta. The name Bastet, the House of Bastet, was not merely a description of a temple complex. It was the name of the capital of an empire. The cat goddess, who had begun as a local deity of the Delta, had become the divine patron of a pharaonic dynasty. The bronze cat in the British Museum sits in its case. Its empty eyes catch the gallery light. Around its neck, the collar. On its chest, the scarab. At its ears, the small gold rings. Someone made this. Someone in the Nile Delta 2,000 years ago, or 3,000, sat with a piece of bronze and a set of tools and made an object worthy of a goddess. They carried it to a temple. They placed it before an altar. They asked for something, or gave thanks for something, or simply wanted to say, "I was here. I believed." In part 2, we go to the temple itself. We walk the causeway, enter the grove of trees, hear the sistrum. Rest here. The cat is watching. In Bubastis, the Nile moves in its channels. The cats sleep in the shade of the temple grove. And the goddess watches, with her green eyes, over everything that is hers. The worship. Imagine you are a pilgrim. The year is somewhere in the 5th century BCE. You are Egyptian, a woman, perhaps, from a town in the Delta, where the Nile braids itself into channels and the fields are green and heavy and the air smells of water and mud and the particular sweetness of the lotus that blooms at the river's edge. You have been saving for this journey for a year. You have made arrangements for your children, your household, your animals. You have packed food and offerings and the good linen that you wear only for festivals. You are going to Bubastis. The boat that carries you is crowded, a river barge, low in the water with the weight of the pilgrims packed onto it, smelling of bodies and incense and wine. The women around you are already singing. Someone has a sistrum and is shaking it in the particular rhythm that belongs to Bastet's worship, a rhythm you have known since childhood, that your mother taught you, that her mother taught her. The Nile moves beneath you. The banks slide past. And ahead, growing slowly larger as you approach, you can see the tops of the trees that grow in the sacred grove around the temple. You are almost there. The temple of Bastet at Bubastis was not a single building but a complex, a precinct that enclosed gardens, shrines, lesser temples, priestly quarters, and the dwelling places of the sacred cats, all surrounding the main sanctuary where the goddess herself was housed. Herodotus's description of the precinct gives us its most vivid surviving account. He describes the temple as sitting on an island, surrounded on three sides by channels of the Nile, accessible on the fourth by a processional causeway. The causeway was lined with very tall trees, their trunks gleaming in the river light, their canopies meeting overhead to create a green tunnel through which pilgrims processed toward the sanctuary. The main temple building was built of red granite, a stone that the Egyptians associated with solar energy and divine presence, quarried far to the south at Aswan and transported down the Nile at enormous expense. The walls were carved with reliefs depicting the goddess in her various forms, as a seated cat, as a woman with a cat's head, as a lioness-headed woman with the solar disk above her, as a mother nursing her young. Inside the main sanctuary, in the innermost chamber accessible only to the highest priests, stood the cult statue of Bastet, her physical presence in the world, the divine body in which the goddess could take up residence during rituals. We do not know what this statue looked like, because no certain example has survived. It may have been made of precious materials, adorned with jewelry and fine linen, tended daily with offerings of food and water and perfume. Around the main sanctuary were smaller chapels for the other gods. No Egyptian religious complex was devoted to a single deity, and the great open courts where the festival gatherings took place, where sacrifices were made and music was played and the crowds of pilgrims could participate in the worship without entering the restricted inner precincts. Egyptian temple worship was not primarily a communal activity in the way that Christian or Islamic worship is communal. The temple was not a place where ordinary people gathered to pray together. It was the house of the god, the place where the divine presence lived, and where the priests tended that presence through a daily ritual of care and sustenance that had more in common with the service of a living king than with anything we would recognize as religious observance. The daily ritual of Bastet's temple followed the general pattern of Egyptian temple practice, adapted to the specific nature of the goddess. In the morning, priests would enter the innermost sanctuary, break the seals on the statue's chamber, open the doors, and perform the ritual of awakening, a liturgical act in which the goddess was greeted as if she had been asleep, offered water to wash with, clothing to wear, food to eat, perfume to scent herself with. This was not metaphor. The Egyptians understood the cult statue to be genuinely inhabited by the divine, that the goddess was, in some real sense, present in her image, and that the care given to the image was care given to the goddess herself. Neglecting the ritual, allowing the statue to go without its offerings, failing to recite the proper words, entering the sanctuary in an impure state, was not merely a failure of propriety. It was a failure of cosmic maintenance. The gods required care just as the world required the Nile's flood. For Bastet specifically, the daily ritual included the music that was inseparable from her nature. Sistrum players attended every major ritual. The sound of the sacred rattle was the sound of the goddess's pleasure, and the pleasure of the goddess was the condition for her continued protection of the world. Among the most important functions of Bastet's sacred cats was their role as oracles. Egyptian religious practice made extensive use of oracles, moments in which the divine communicated with the human world through the behavior of a sacred animal or the movement of a sacred object. The cats of Bastet's temple were observed by priests trained to interpret their behavior as divine communication. The direction a cat moved, the posture it adopted, the sounds it made, all of these could be read as the goddess's response to a question, her instruction to a supplicant, her endorsement or refusal of a proposed action. This practice was not limited to Bastet's cats. The sacred Apis bulls of Memphis, the sacred crocodiles of certain Delta temples, the ibises of Thoth sanctuaries, all served oracular functions. But the cats of Bastet occupy a special place in the record because their behavior, being the behavior of domestic cats, was familiar enough to the people who observed it to be interpreted with a kind of intimacy that the behavior of a bull or crocodile could never achieve. A cat that approached a supplicant could be read as the goddess's blessing. A cat that turned away could be read as her refusal. A cat that settled in someone's lap, well, anyone who has ever had a cat settle in their lap uninvited knows the particular quality of that experience, the weight and warmth of it, the purring that vibrates through the body, the sense of being chosen by something that chooses very selectively. The Egyptians, who were acute observers of the natural world, understood that cats are not indifferent to human beings. They are selective. They have preferences. They give their attention where they choose to give it, and they withhold it from those they dislike or distrust. To be chosen by Bastet's cat was to be chosen by Bastet herself. The small bronze cat in the British Museum is one of hundreds of thousands of similar objects that have been recovered from Egyptian archaeological sites, and specifically from sites associated with Bastet. The Egyptian practice of leaving votive offerings at temples, small objects made to be given to the god as tokens of devotion, petition, or thanksgiving, produced, at the temples of the most popular deities, astonishing quantities of material. The temple of Bastet at Bubastis and the related cult sites across the Delta were the recipients of an enormous outpouring of cat-related votive objects over the roughly 2,000 years of Bastet's most active worship. Cat statues of every size and material, bronze, faience, limestone, wood, precious metals. Cat amulets worn around the neck and wrist. Sistrum rattles. Small plaques depicting the goddess in her various forms. And, most poignantly, the mummified bodies of cats themselves. The offering of a mummified cat to Bastet was an act of particular devotion, a gift of one of the goddess's sacred animals, returned to her care in death. Pilgrims to Bubastis and other Bastet shrines could purchase mummified cats from vendors near the temple precincts, in the same way that Christian pilgrims to medieval shrines could purchase badges and relics from vendors at the shrines. Entrance. The cats were selected, killed, mummified with care, wrapped in linen, and sold as offerings. This practice continued for centuries, and the catacombs near the temple sites filled, over time, with hundreds of thousands of cat mummies, a density of devotion that is, when you contemplate it, almost overwhelming. The love of a civilization for its goddess, expressed in the small bodies of the animals she loved. More than almost any other Egyptian deity, Bastet was associated with the sensory pleasures, with sound, with movement, with the body's capacity for joy. The sistrum was her instrument, and its sound permeated her worship. The sistrum is a kind of frame rattle, a handle attached to a U-shaped frame through which metal rods or rings are threaded, so that shaking the instrument produces a continuous metallic rattling sound. The sound has been described by those who have heard ancient reproductions as somewhere between a tambourine and a rain stick, rhythmic, hypnotic, not melodic in itself but capable of carrying and animating a melody played alongside it. In Egyptian religious art, the sistrum is depicted being played by priestesses and queens, by the goddess Hathor and her devotees, by Bastet herself. It is an instrument explicitly associated with feminine divine energy, with the power of the goddess to create the conditions for her own presence. Alongside the sistrum came dance. Egyptian temple reliefs depict dancers in the service of Hathor and Bastet, female figures in light linen, their bodies in motion, their hair loose, their movements expressive of the pleasure and energy of the divine. Dance in this context was not entertainment. It was theology, a physical enactment of the goddess's nature, a performance of the joy that was her essence. And then there was incense. The temples of Egypt were fragrant places: cedar resin, frankincense, myrrh, kyphi, the complex perfume blend that the Egyptians burned specifically in the evening to honor the gods and to create a sensory environment that was understood as pleasing to the divine. The smell of the temples was the smell of the gods, and to breathe it was to be, in some small way, in their presence. All of these sensory elements worked together. The sound of the sistrum, the movement of the dancers, the smell of the incense, the sight of the goddess's image gleaming in the lamplight, the worship of Bastet was a total sensory experience, designed to open every channel of perception to the divine. One aspect of Bastet's worship that is less well known but deeply significant is her role as a healer. Egyptian medicine and Egyptian religion were not separate domains. The gods were implicated in illness and health in ways that the modern mind tends to separate out. Disease was not merely a physical phenomenon but a spiritual one, and healing required both physical and spiritual intervention. Several deities were associated with healing, and Bastet was among the most important. Her role as healer derived partly from her nature as a protective goddess, protection against illness being an extension of protection against all other threats, and partly from the specific association between cats and medical practice in ancient Egypt. Egyptian physicians observed, as anyone who has owned a cat knows, that cats are remarkably good at finding warm, comfortable places and settling into them with a focused quality of rest. The Egyptian association between cats and healing may reflect an actual practice, allowing cats to move through sick wards, perhaps, and observing which patients the cats chose to sit with. There are magical texts associated with Bastet's cult that were used in healing rituals, invocations of the goddess's power over specific diseases, protections against the demons believed to cause illness, instructions for the preparation of medicines that combined physical ingredients with ritual actions. The cat's association with the clearing of vermin, rats, mice, snakes, may have given it a more literal healing function, as the killer. Of the animals that spread disease, the cat was, in a real epidemiological sense, a protector of human health. The lamps are lit in the sanctuary. The sistrum has been set aside. The pilgrims have returned to their boats. In the grove of trees around the temple, the cats move through the shadows, stepping carefully, as cats do, placing each paw with deliberate precision, their eyes reflecting the lamplight in brief green flashes. In the innermost chamber, the goddess watches. In Part 3, we go deeper into the story of the cats themselves, into the extraordinary and sometimes disturbing relationship between the most cat-loving civilization in history and the animals it loved. Rest here. The incense is still burning. The cats are settling for the night. In their slow, deliberate way, they are choosing their places. The cats. Let us talk about the cats themselves. Not the goddess, not the temple, not the theology, the actual animals. The small, warm, purring, frequently indifferent, occasionally affectionate creatures that the ancient Egyptians elevated to a status of religious significance unmatched in any other culture in human history. The domestic cat, Felis catus, in the taxonomy, is a relatively recent companion to human beings, in the long arc of our shared evolutionary history. Dogs were domesticated perhaps 15,000 years ago. Cats came later, perhaps 10,000 years ago, perhaps less. And the domestication, such as it is, happened differently than it did with dogs. Dogs were domesticated through deliberate human selection. We chose the wolves that were most cooperative, most trainable, most useful, and we bred them over generations into the animals we wanted. Cats, by contrast, appear to have domesticated themselves. The development of agriculture, of grain storage, of the food surpluses that drew mice, created an ecological opportunity for the small wildcats of the Near East and North Africa. The cats that were least afraid of humans could exploit this opportunity. They came closer to human settlements. They killed the rodents. They were tolerated, fed, eventually welcomed. And over time, those most tolerant of human proximity passed that tolerance to their offspring. The domestic cat chose to live with us, at least as much as we chose to live with it. And the ancient Egyptians, with their acute attention to the natural world, seem to have understood and appreciated this. The cat's independence, its quality of being present on its own terms, of giving its affection selectively and never wholly, was not a flaw to be corrected. It was part of what made the cat divine. The wild ancestor of the domestic cat in Egypt was Felis libica, the African wildcat, a slightly larger, more long-legged version of the domestic cat, still found across North Africa and the Middle East today. The African wildcat is the primary ancestor of all domestic cats, and its domestication appears to have begun in the Fertile Crescent and spread westward into Egypt. The earliest evidence for cats in Egyptian domestic contexts dates to around 2000 BCE, the Middle Kingdom period, though some scholars argue for earlier associations. By the New Kingdom, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, the domestic cat was firmly established in Egyptian households, depicted in tomb paintings sitting under chairs, playing with fish, eating from dishes, wearing collars, being held by their owners with an unmistakable quality of affection. These tomb paintings are among the most charming products of Egyptian art, and they are charming precisely because of their ordinariness. The Egyptians painted their cats because they loved them, in the same way that people today photograph their cats, not for religious reasons, not to make theological statements, but because the cat was a beloved member of the household and its presence belonged in the record of that household's life. But alongside this domestic affection, something else was developing. The cat's utility as a killer of rodents and snakes, particularly the highly venomous snakes that were a genuine danger in Egyptian homes and fields, gave it a quality of protectiveness that resonated with the religious qualities of Bastet. The cat that killed the snake in the garden was performing, in miniature, the same act that Ra performed when he killed the serpent Apophis each night to allow the sun to rise again. The domestic cat was a small, daily version of a cosmic drama. No other animal in the ancient world was depicted with the frequency and affection that the Egyptians devoted to the cat. The evidence is everywhere in the archaeological record. In tomb paintings, cats accompany their owners on hunting trips in the marshes, sitting in the bow of the boat, alert to the birds flushing from the papyrus reeds. In domestic scenes, cats sit under chairs and accept scraps from the family table. In more formal religious contexts, the cat appears in solar mythology, as the great tomcat who defeats the serpent Apophis at the base of the Persea tree in Heliopolis, an image that appears in the Book of the Dead and on countless amulets. The Egyptians gave their cats names. This in itself is significant. Most domestic animals in the ancient world were not named individually. But Egyptian papyri and inscriptions record cat names with the same ease and frequency as they record human names: Nejm, meaning sweet, Timiw, meaning the tom, names that convey affection and personality. They also depicted cats playing. One of the most delightful categories of Egyptian minor art is the so-called satirical papyri, images, apparently made for private amusement, depicting animals in human roles. There are cats depicted as musicians, playing the lute and the harp. Cats depicted as servants, waiting on mice. Cats engaged in domestic activities. These images are funny, deliberately funny, and the humor depends on the viewer finding the cats recognizable, on knowing exactly what a real cat looks like, how it moves, what its expressions mean. The Egyptians knew their cats intimately. They had been watching them, living with them, loving them for centuries. And that intimacy shaped their religion. The ancient sources describe legal protections for cats in Egypt that, if accurate, represent one of the most remarkable pieces of animal welfare legislation in the ancient world. The most famous account comes from Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian of the 1st century BCE, who wrote that anyone who killed a cat in Egypt, even accidentally, was subject to the death penalty. He describes a specific incident in which a Roman citizen accidentally killed a cat during his time in Egypt, and was torn apart by a mob despite the protests of the Egyptian authorities, who reportedly feared the diplomatic repercussions of executing a Roman but could not control the popular anger at the cat's death. Modern historians are skeptical of the detail of this account. Diodorus was writing for a Greek and Roman audience that found Egyptian cat worship exotic and somewhat ridiculous, and his account has the quality of a story told to illustrate a point about Egyptian irrationality rather than a careful historical record. The scale of the popular violence he describes seems exaggerated. But the underlying point, that cats in Egypt had a protected status that made their killing, even accidentally, a serious matter, is consistent with other evidence. The sacred animals of any Egyptian temple were under the explicit protection of the temple institution and, by extension, of the pharaonic authority that backed it. Killing a sacred cat was not merely an offense against an individual animal. It was an act of sacrilege against the goddess whose animal it was. Outside the temple context, the domestic cat's protected status was probably less absolute but still real. A culture that mourned its cats, that mummified them, that made votive offerings of them to the goddess, that culture was not indifferent to the lives of cats. The emotional investment was genuine, and emotional investment creates its own informal protections. When a cat died in ancient Egypt, the household mourned. Diodorus Siculus, who is not always reliable, describes the mourning for a dead cat as including the shaving of eyebrows, the same mark of grief used for the death of a human family member. Modern historians treat this specific claim with caution, but the general principle, that cats were mourned as members of the household, is confirmed by other evidence. The act of mummification is itself a form of mourning. To mummify a body is to refuse to let it simply return to the earth, to preserve it, to prepare it for what comes after, to treat the dead individual as someone whose continued existence matters. The Egyptians mummified their cats for the same reason they mummified their dead, because the cat was beloved and its continued existence in the afterlife was something they cared about. The cat mummies recovered from Egyptian archaeological sites are remarkable objects. They were prepared with genuine care, wrapped in linen with the same techniques used for human mummies, sometimes adorned with painted masks depicting the cat's face, sometimes bound in elaborate geometric patterns of linen bandaging that are beautiful in their own right. The effort expended on these mummies, the time, the materials, the skill, represents a real investment, made by people who found the investment worth making. Not all cat mummies were the products of private grief, however. As we will discuss in the next section, the cat mummy industry in ancient Egypt was also a commercial operation of considerable scale, and not all of it was tender. In 1888, a farmer near the ancient city of Beni Hassan, in central Egypt, discovered a network of underground galleries cut into the cliff face above the Nile. Inside the galleries were hundreds of thousands of mummified cats. Perhaps millions. Stacked in layers, filling the tunnels from floor to ceiling, accumulated over centuries of religious practice. It was the largest find of animal mummies in Egyptian archaeological history, and it created immediate problems for the people who discovered it. The problems were of a Victorian and commercial nature. Egypt in 1888 was under British influence, and the cat mummies were treated not as the priceless archaeological artifacts they were but as a bulk commodity. They were shipped to England and sold as fertilizer. 19 tons of them. The cats that had been mourned by ancient Egyptians, mummified with care, placed in the goddess's catacombs as acts of devotion, were ground up and spread on English fields. The story is appalling, and it is also a measure of how completely the world that produced those mummies had been forgotten. To the Victorian merchants who sold them and the English farmers who bought them, they were not the artifacts of a religious tradition. They were old bones. But before we grieve only for the Victorian destruction, we should acknowledge a complexity in the cat mummy tradition itself. Analysis of surviving cat mummies has revealed that many of them, perhaps the majority, were killed as young animals, probably by breaking the neck or strangling. They were not mummies of cats that had died naturally and been brought to the temple in grief. They were cats that had been raised specifically to be killed and offered, in a kind of industrial-scale votive sacrifice. The love of cats and the killing of cats existed in the same cult. The civilization that made it a capital offense to kill a cat also bred cats in temple precincts for the specific purpose of mummifying and selling them as offerings. The tenderness and the violence were not contradictions in the Egyptian religious mind, they were aspects of the same devotion. The sacred cats of Bastet's temples did not end with a single moment. They ended gradually, over centuries, as the religious world of ancient Egypt was slowly transformed by Greek, Roman, and eventually Christian influence. The Ptolemaic period, the era of Greek rule following Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt in 332 BCE, was, paradoxically, a period of renewed religious enthusiasm for the Egyptian cults. The Ptolemaic kings, eager to legitimate their rule in the eyes of their Egyptian subjects, sponsored temple construction and supported the traditional priesthoods. Bastet's cult flourished under Ptolemaic patronage, and the cat mummy industry reached its peak during this period. The Roman period brought more ambivalence. Romans found Egyptian animal worship fascinating and somewhat absurd, a quality of patronizing amusement runs through many Roman accounts of Egyptian religion, but they were also capable of genuine engagement with it. The cult of Bastet spread, in limited form, to Rome itself, where cat-related imagery became part of the religious repertoire of those interested in Egyptian religion. It was Christianity, ultimately, that ended the ancient cults. The Edict of Thessalonica in 380 CE made Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire, and the subsequent decades saw the systematic suppression of the old religions, the closing of temples, the destruction of cult statues, the outlawing of traditional sacrifice. The temple of Bastet at Bubastis was closed. The sacred cats were no longer tended. The catacombs were sealed. The cats, of course, continued to exist. They had been living with human beings for thousands of years, and human beings needed them. They remained in the houses, in the fields, in the granaries. They went on killing mice and rats and snakes. They went on sitting in laps, purring when stroked, ignoring whoever they chose to ignore. Only the religious apparatus that had surrounded them was gone. The catacombs are empty now. Or nearly empty. What the Victorian fertilizer merchants left behind has been carefully catalogued and studied, the surviving mummies preserved in museums across the world. In the cliff face above the Nile, the galleries cut by ancient hands still open into the hillside. The cats that filled them are mostly gone. But the galleries remain, the negative space of a devotion so enormous that it required a mountain to contain it. In Part 4, we ask the question that all of this raises. What does it mean that human beings loved something this much? What does it mean that the love and the sacrifice existed side by side? Rest here. Somewhere in Egypt, in the evening light, a cat sits in a doorway. It is watching something that we cannot see. The end and the echo. The temples of Bastet are ruins now. The great precinct at Bubastis was excavated in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and what the excavators found was a palimpsest of destruction and rebuilding spread across 3,000 years, foundations of earlier temples beneath later ones, blocks reused and recarved, the archaeological evidence of a site that had been continuously important and continuously remade. Today, the site is partially accessible to visitors. The ruins are significant enough to have attracted scholarly attention, but they are not among the great showpieces of Egyptian archaeology. There are no standing columns, no intact reliefs, no dramatic vistas of preserved antiquity. There are foundations, fragments, a few carved blocks with the cat-headed goddess still recognizable in the worn stone. The temple grove that so moved Herodotus is gone. The channels of the Nile that made the temple an island have long since dried up or been redirected. The cats that lived in the sacred precincts have dispersed into the general population of the Nile Delta, where their descendants still live, street cats, farm cats, the ordinary domestic cats of modern Egypt, who carry in their bodies the genetic inheritance of the sacred cats of Bastet without knowing it. What remains is the question that the ruins raise. What does it mean that this existed? What does it mean that it ended? And what, if anything, of the world that produced Bastet and her cult survives in us? The transformation of Egypt from a civilization centered on its ancient religious traditions to a Christian and then Islamic society was not a sudden rupture but a long, uneven process that took centuries. The closing of the temples in the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE did not mean the immediate disappearance of the religious practices that had been carried out in them. Ancient religions do not die cleanly. They transform, go underground, attach themselves to new forms, persist in folk practice and local custom long after the institutional structures that supported them have been destroyed. Elements of the Bastet cult probably survived in folk practices associated with cats, practices that the new religious authorities discouraged but could not entirely eliminate. The association between cats and the protection of the home, between cats and the warding off of evil, between cats and feminine protective power, these associations persisted in the folk traditions of Egypt and the wider Mediterranean world long after Bastet herself had ceased to be officially worshipped. The early Christian church in Egypt was deeply ambivalent about cats. On one hand, cats were useful, they killed the vermin that threatened the grain stores of monasteries and convents. On the other hand, they were associated with the old religion, with the cult of Bastet, with the pagan practices that the church was working to replace. The church's eventual accommodation of cats, allowing them in monasteries, tolerating their presence in religious buildings, probably reflects the impossibility of demonizing a creature that was too practically useful and too genuinely beloved to be successfully cast as an agent of darkness. The Prophet Muhammad was, by all accounts, a man who loved cats. The hadith, the recorded sayings and actions of Muhammad that form, alongside the Quran, the foundation of Islamic tradition, includes numerous references to the Prophet's affection for cats and his instruction that they be treated kindly. The most famous story involves his cat Mu'etzah, who had fallen asleep on the sleeve of the Prophet's robe. Rather than disturb the cat, Muhammad cut off the sleeve when he needed to rise for prayer. This story, whether historical or legendary, established a template for Islamic attitudes toward cats that has persisted to the present day. In the Islamic tradition, cats are considered ritually clean animals, unlike dogs, which are ritually impure and cannot be kept in the home for most purposes. Cats are welcome in mosques. They are fed by charitable foundations. In Istanbul and Cairo and across the Islamic world, the relationship between the urban population and its cats is characterized by a warmth and acceptance that has deep cultural roots. Some scholars have suggested that the Islamic rehabilitation of the cat, its elevation from pagan cult animal to clean, beloved companion, represents a cultural continuity with the pre-Islamic traditions of Egypt and the Near East. The love of cats that manifested in the cult of Bastet was not extinguished by the arrival of new religions. It was absorbed, transformed, given new religious justifications, and continued. The cats of Cairo today are the descendants of the sacred cats of Bastet's temple. They do not know this. But the thread of devotion is unbroken. The story of the cat in Western Europe is considerably darker. The association of cats with paganism, specifically with the goddess religions of the pre-Christian world, made them suspect in medieval Christian culture. Cats, particularly black cats, became associated with witchcraft, with the devil, with the feminine power that the dominant religious culture had decided was dangerous. The persecution of cats in medieval Europe was real and, by any modern standard, horrifying. Cats were killed in large numbers at certain festivals, thrown from towers, burned in bonfires, associated in popular imagination with the forces that Christianity was fighting against. There is a bitter historical irony here. The domestic cat, which had been associated in the ancient world with the protection of granaries from rats, was persecuted in medieval Europe with such enthusiasm that rodent populations grew dramatically, contributing, some historians have argued, to the ecological conditions that made the Black Death more devastating than it might otherwise have been. The destruction of the cats that killed the rats allowed the rats to multiply, and with them the fleas that carried Yersinia pestis. The goddess's cats, persecuted by the civilization that had forgotten the goddess, may have exacted a terrible revenge. The rehabilitation of cats in Western culture came gradually, through the literature of the Renaissance and early modern period, through the spread of urban cat-keeping among the educated classes, through the Enlightenment's general softening toward animals. By the 19th century, the cat had become a fashionable companion, associated with the literary and artistic life of the period. Edgar Allan Poe, Charles Baudelaire, Victor Hugo, the dark poets of the modern age had an affinity for cats that echoes, at a great distance, the affinity of the ancient Egyptians. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, advances in archaeological science have allowed researchers to understand the cat mummy tradition with a depth and nuance that earlier generations could not achieve. DNA analysis of cat mummies has produced remarkable findings. The genetic diversity of the mummified cats suggests that they were not descended from a single breeding population but were gathered from across Egypt and the surrounding regions, brought to the temple sites from a wide catchment area, representing the cats of many different households, many different communities. This means that the cat mummies are not simply products of a temple industry. They are also, many of them, the genuine remains of beloved animals, cats that had lived in homes, been named, been cared for, and whose owners brought their bodies to the temple after death because the temple was the right place for a cat to be sent into the afterlife. The distinction between the loving and the industrial dimensions of the cat mummy tradition is real but not always clear-cut. A pilgrimage to Bubastis to deposit a mummified household cat could also involve purchasing additional mummified cats as votive offerings, the personal and the commercial existing side by side, as they do in most religious traditions. What the archaeology makes clear is the scale of the devotion. Hundreds of thousands of cat mummies, accumulated over centuries, at sites across Egypt. This is not a marginal practice. It is a central expression of a religious culture that took the cat's divine status seriously enough to invest enormous resources in honoring it. For all that we know about Bastet and her cult, there is much that we don't know, much that the ancient sources don't record, or that the archaeological record doesn't preserve, or that we simply haven't yet found. We don't know what the great cult statue of Bastet at Bubastis looked like. We have the descriptions of ancient visitors, but no surviving image has been identified with certainty. The statue that stood in the innermost sanctuary, the object that was the literal focal point of one of the most important religious cults in the ancient world, is gone. We don't know the full extent of the sacred cat's role in Egyptian healing practice. The association between Bastet and medicine is documented, but the specific practices, the rituals, the medicines, the role of the living cat in therapeutic contexts, are preserved only in fragmentary texts. We don't know what ordinary Egyptians believed about the cat's divine nature. We have the official theology, the priestly literature, the formal religious texts. We don't have the conversations at the kitchen table, the private prayers, the spontaneous expressions of devotion that were never written down. The inner life of Egyptian popular religion, what ordinary people actually felt when they looked at their cat, is largely beyond our reach. What we do know is that the devotion was real. The mummies are there. The bronze cats are there. The votive offerings are there in their hundreds of thousands, in museums around the world. Something moved the ancient Egyptians to make all of this, to give this much, to care this much, to pour this much love into the small, warm, independent creature that had chosen to live with them. There is a cat somewhere near you tonight. Perhaps in your house. Perhaps on your street. Perhaps only in the ancient memory of the species, in the evolutionary legacy that has made the domestic cat one of the most successful large animals on Earth, precisely because it found a way to be useful and beloved at the same time. The cats of ancient Egypt are gone. The temples that housed them are ruins. The goddess who watched over them has not been worshipped for 1,500 years. And the civilization that loved her has been dust for longer than that. But the cats remain. The small, warm, purring, independent, occasionally affectionate creatures remain, carrying in their bodies the same DNA as the sacred cats of Bastet's temple, looking at us with the same green eyes that looked out from the cult statues, choosing when to come close and when to stay away, giving their attention where they choose to give it and withholding it from those they dislike. The goddess is gone. The cats are still here. And if you watch them for long enough, the way they settle, the way they watch, the way they sometimes seem to be seeing something in the room that you cannot see, you might understand, just for a moment, why a civilization looked at this creature and thought, there is something here that is more than animal. There is something here that is watching over us. There is something here that is, in its small and warm and inexplicable way, divine. The lamps of Bubastis have been dark for a very long time. But somewhere in Egypt, tonight, a cat is sitting in a doorway. Its eyes are half closed. It is listening to something we cannot hear. Good night.